Good morning, and let me begin by very sincerely saying how pleasurable it is to be here and what an honor it is to be here. Thank you to the organizers and the sponsors of the conference. Particularly, is it an honor to be here on the 100th anniversary of the founding of the Australian capital. In fact, in the past, I have made some very small study of the development of Canberra. And one thing I remember that may still have resonance today is that the location of this city was the subject of several quite sophisticated studies from the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century. We would now call these multi-criteria cost-benefit analyses, but that's not what they were called at the time. For example, if you look back at the Capital Sites Inquiry Board of 1903, it did a pretty good job, even by today's standards, evaluating a whole series of different possible locations. However, the reason I'm beginning with this is that the actual trajectory of development, as I'm sure many of you know, was determined not by these evidence-based studies, but rather by the twists and turns of a rather complicated and occasionally quite parochial political process. Now, this may well have been very frustrating for some of the visionaries and planners, but it's actually how it should have been. Politics drove administration. And we would do well to remember that order of priority during our discussions on how to achieve smarter, better, and broader public services. I've been asked to speak on some very broad issues indeed. How can government be improved? How can we learn from the past for the future? And I speak to you primarily as an academic, which I see is a fairly small, indeed possibly an endangered species at this conference, judging by the statistics we saw a moment ago. And I also speak to you as a POM. Now, I believe I'm cleared to say that because I read that there was a judgment by the Australian Advertising Standards Board in 2006 that POM was not actually an offensive term. It was actually quite friendly. So having been called a POM a few times in the past and having felt slightly insulted, I now realize that you were all just being very kind. I'm a comparativist in academic terms, and I compare mainly national governments and international organizations, and that's the position I'll be speaking from. I spent the last 14 years of my professional life living and working on continental Europe, in the Netherlands and in Belgium, in Brussels and Leuven. And earlier on I spent a year in the United States. So I hope I'm slightly less insular than some other POMs. And by the way, there is a paper, quite a substantial paper, which I wrote for this conference, which has all the academic references and probably more than you might wish to look at. And the conference organizers tell me that that paper will be on the conference website right about now. We didn't have a public management institute at Leuven in 1425, just for the sake of clarification. We had a university. The Public Management Institute didn't appear until the 1990s and was part of the, I think, almost global trend towards greater prominence for the subject that we are studying and discussing at this conference. Now, a very brief history of public management reform. As you're probably aware, there's been a huge volume of reform, of changes in structures and processes, particularly since about 1980, right across the OECD world. New Zealand, Australia, and the UK being among the pioneers. You might conclude from this that by now we should know how to do it, that there would be a settled body of knowledge or even a handbook telling us how to do major public management reforms. But there isn't. In fact, in many cases, there have been very substantial reforms where there is hardly any information available about the final outcomes or impacts of the reforms. I was a part of a major European study in the last 2 years where we cooperated across 10 countries, assembling a database of 520 studies of the impact of new public management type reforms right across the EU, including the UK, but right across the EU, working in different languages. It was a very exciting project. Asking each country to identify the key reports, both official reports and academic studies, dealing with the impacts of these reforms. At the end of the study, we found that rather less than 10% of the key studies actually addressed the question of final outcomes or impacts at all. And indeed, only about a quarter of these studies really dealt with changes in outputs that could be directly, confidently attributed to those reforms. So actually, we're rather short of information. Where there is information, and it's still being exhumed, it turns out that the impacts are often rather mixed. Mrs. Thatcher, of course, in my country, is very well known for her relentless drive for efficiency in the civil service. So it's quite a surprise to discover in the latest research, based on very detailed quantitative analysis of the official figures, that there was no general increase in the efficiency of central government during Mrs. Thatcher's period. It's also quite interesting to discover that many of the biggest reforms under the Blair regime in the 1990s and early noughties, again, using official figures and according to the latest research by the London School of Economics, the pattern of productivity improvements was extremely patchy, and many major services that were reformed in a very fundamental way showed no productivity gain. Indeed, it was quite common to show a slight loss of productivity immediately following a reform and for the next 2 or 3 years. Looking across our database that I just mentioned, we discovered that overall, in the few cases where outcomes could be identified, about 44% of those cases, there seemed to be some improvement in outcomes. In 23% of those cases, outcomes actually got worse, and in the remainder, they were unchanged. Slightly better result for outputs, changes in outputs, but even there, it was only 53% of the reform cases where outputs seem to have improved. What this tells me is that the wine glass is both half empty and half full. That public management reform is not a straightforward process. It's not the application of a scientific rule. It's something which is quite chancy. Of course, reformers frequently labor under the handicap of having pretty vague or contradictory objectives, often set by the politicians, and we understand the reasons for that. But it makes the whole business of evaluating what happened quite difficult. I may also say that there is very little, certainly in the UK and in France, and to some extent in Germany, there is very little evidence that either politicians or leading figures in the public services of those countries, after major reform programs were implemented, were particularly interested in discovering the results. They were very interested in launching them. They were very interested in the initial processes of trying to implement them. But by the time you were actually getting to results, 2-3 years out, people had moved on, the focus of political interest had moved on, and there was remarkably little attempt for many of the biggest UK reforms ever to look back and discover what really happened over the medium term. There have been quite a few reversals and U-turns in reform, where you've gone from centralization to decentralization, where you've gone from a hierarchy to a quasi-market, and then you've gone back again in many countries. So there's almost a cycling. And a few countries have suffered what I term redisorganizations, where the pace of change has been so relentless and so fast that reform fatigue sets in, and that there is a loss of continuity and a loss of grip. This takes various forms. For example, very rapid rotation of individuals in top posts. We've had that in the UK, where the length of time people are in permanent secretary, deputy secretary, undersecretary posts in some departments has shortened dramatically over the last 25 years. And there are a number of other symptoms. It's not just the UK. There are works which show similar things happening in the United States. Trying to interpret all this, some of the best academic studies, and I'm not referring to my own, but some of the studies which I think are most thorough and competent and independent, point to the tremendous importance of contextual variations. What works here doesn't work there necessarily. What worked 5 years ago or 2 years ago doesn't necessarily work now. There's an enormous body of work in academia and quite a bit in reports of things like national audit offices, which support this idea that contextual factors are crucial. And contextual factors include many things, but they include what type of political system you're working in, what the existing administrative culture is, what the fiscal climate is, and that goes up and down, obviously, what the current administrative capacity is. I mean, take Eastern Europe, where you have countries where the public service had no experience whatsoever of contracting out, and after the liberation from the communist regimes, in some of those countries you had mass contracting out. So was it really surprising that it was disastrous and became very corrupt and disorganized and ministries lost control of large parts of the public service? No, it should have been absolutely predictable, but apparently it wasn't. Now, if we look at what big ideas, and here I'm on a very high level of generalization, if I look at what big ideas animated this tsunami of reforms, I would say that although academics have 120 different labels for things, I was counting the other day and I found 15 different types of governance without having to look very far for in the academic work. But I'm going to be extraordinarily simple, probably oversimple, and say that there are at least 3 big ideas. One, I've called dissolution, which is the idea that the public sector is inherently inefficient and problematic, and therefore the solution is to minimize it. Privatize as much as you can, contract out as much as you can, and what's left in the core should be subject to market-like disciplines, performance management, and the application of a whole range of private sector management techniques. So that's one idea, and of course that was quite an important idea within the new public management movement. Second big idea, I think, is a revolution where very often people who are steeped in the public service believe that it can be moved and it should be moved from a set of classic hierarchies, siloed, to an agile, customer-focused, joined-up system where the customer or the citizen, and we can have an argument about which term is the most appropriate, I tend to prefer citizen, where the citizen becomes an active participant, not a passive recipient. The citizen indeed becomes a co-producer, and I think some innovations in Australia and some of the academic work in Australia has been among the best in the world on that. Third idea, evolution, where governance becomes the key word, not government, so that governance, much broader than the formal institutions of government, become the appropriate frame for analysis, and public services are delivered by a constellation, varying constellations of organizations from the third sector, from the public sector proper, if I could call it that, and from the private for-profit sector. And this idea, which I suppose is more or less dominant at the moment in many countries, obviously picks up elements from the previous 2 ideas and re-molds them. A word or two, very briefly, assessing these big ideas. None of them are new. They are all quite old, and in fact, some of them are as old as the state itself, although they have adopted new labels from time to time. All of them are problematic in one way or another. Just running through very quickly, the public versus private sector efficiency debate, I think, will never be resolved. It's been running strongly for at least 30 years now in different countries. Advocates on each side can cite vivid examples of the success or failure, of the success of their side of the argument and the failure on the other side of the argument. It's an extremely complex process, and my take on it is that it all depends, and it all depends on those contextual factors that I was talking about earlier. But in any case, of course, efficiency, tremendously important though it is only one of the relevant values for public service. There are several other key values which are not expressed if we simply apply efficiency and productivity measures to public organizations. Citizen-centered is a good idea. It has an inherent appeal. You know, I like it too. But what should be done when citizens disagree, which they frequently do, and what should be done when citizens have to be in some way regulated or disciplined or obliged to do things that they would not want to do themselves? That is also a very important part of the work of the state, an inescapable part. If you're talking about policing, if you're talking about certain public health measures, if you're talking about certain planning measures, sooner or later you end up in the position of requiring at least some sections of the citizenry to do things which they would not voluntarily do themselves and probably would not want to do. But they are required to do them for some notion of the greater public interest. Joined-up government is also good. I've been enthusiastic about it, like many other people. But in practice, this has often involved some loss of clarity, accountability, and it may often also mean rather slower decision-making as all the stakeholders in the network need to be consulted and need to have an opportunity to have their say. So it's not entirely unproblematic. Innovation, as I understand it, inevitably means risk-taking. You cannot have innovation without risk-taking, and risk-taking means that you will have failures. In the corporate literature, as you probably know, there are various estimates of what a good rate of successful innovation is, ranging from 10% to 40 or 50%. But even the most optimistic ones leave a lot of room for failures. I'm not sure if civil servants, ministers, legislatures, and particularly the media, are ready to accept the idea that public servants will try things and fail fairly often. It's still very tempting for the media and for politicians to seize on these and scapegoat and punish. And that, of course, has an effect on the willingness of public servants to innovate, which I'm sure is a topic that will come up in more than one session at this conference. Multi-level pluralistic governance is a beautiful idea, but again, there are questions about what happens to clear lines of accountability and liability, and how does the blame game play out in these new, much more complex situations. But the things I'm talking about, I'm not trying to say that the big ideas are bad. I'm trying to say that each one has limits and involves trade-offs, occasionally maybe even contradictions, and that each big idea has some truth in it, but may be beneficial in some contexts and not beneficial at all in others. Reflections. Interestingly enough, yes, I think I missed this one. This should have come earlier. I was always taught that this was Gaius Petronius in the 1st century AD, a Roman courtier. But I chased down the reference and found that that is a common misunderstanding. I think it's a nice quote from actually an American columnist in the 1950s. To get to the end, reflections. There's a paradox here. We have a lot of experience of public management reform. We know a great deal about the processes involved. We know a great deal about what happens with new structures and processes, we know much less about what the final outcomes and impacts on the outside world are, which should be, I would suggest, one of our key tests for the success or failure of reform. We have some big models which are very appealing, public governance and so on. We have some very nice concepts which I'm glad to see will be discussed at this conference, agility, capability and so on. But on the whole, I would say as an academic, when I read stuff that uses those concepts, they are not themselves the answer to anything. They're more like a useful new way to frame a set of problems and issues. And neither are individual techniques, lean, total quality management, ComStat, business process re-engineering, public-private partnerships, etc. None of these are silver bullets which work in every circumstance. Sometimes they do, sometimes they work a bit, but not very well. Sometimes they don't work at all. So we come back to the need to fit reforms to context. So how can we do that? First of all, I suggest by paying more attention to diagnosing the initial problem, just like a doctor takes the presenting problem that the patient brings and then cross-questions, or at least a good doctor does, before they prescribe. I fear that in some countries, hopefully not Australia, but I don't know enough to say, in some countries the prescription has come before the diagnosis. People have come running around saying what we need is business process re-engineering, or what we need is lean. Let's find some problems. I think that's a very dangerous road, and I think there's a need for in-depth diagnosis of what exactly is it that we want to change and why before starting to shop around for solutions. Then what kind of knowledge do we need? I think we certainly need external expert consultancy, which is well represented at this conference. And I say here to tell us what are the range of probable fit practices elsewhere, because I'm not a fan of the idea of best practice, which tends to become rather a context-free idea. And I'm interested to see that the World Bank public management people have taken a big step back from best practice, which they used for years, and are now saying that they don't like that idea, and that you need to get more into the history and context of the particular country and the particular sector before you start to prescribe. And they talk about best fit practices rather than some sort of abstract best practice. And I like that. I think that's clearer thinking. In addition to expert consultancy, I think that full and early use of local knowledge by the people working in the public service, including people working at the street level and on the front line, including their tacit understandings, which they may not be able to formulate as formal propositions, that this is crucial and has often been neglected. And sometimes, of course, you may also need to discuss reforms with citizens from an early stage who will have all sorts of knowledge of the service from a perspective which may not be so familiar to the senior managers of the service. And finally, of course, you would expect me to put in a plug for independent academic research, and I will do that. And I think often some quick academic research at an early stage can help with the diagnosis. So you need, I think, all three kinds of knowledge. You need the craft knowledge of the people who work in the service. You need expert knowledge, where experts bring ideas from elsewhere. And an independent academic voice is often very useful. The real art is to bring those three kinds of knowledge together and to get the people who bear that knowledge to actually talk to each other rather than at each other. And I must say, the big public management reform programs that I've looked at, mainly in Europe and North America, that process of guided integration of different sorts of knowledge in an early stage of reform has hardly ever happened. It's very rare. Occasionally it's attempted, but often it's swept away in the enthusiasm for a quick reform. And last, but by no means least, and this is a particular message for senior public servants, by speaking truth to power. few executive politicians, few ministers in most of the countries where I've worked are natural reformers of large, complex organizations. That's not their background, it's not their first interest, and their time horizons probably don't extend very vividly across the full range of time needed to implement and evaluate a major reform. So they need help, and they need strong advice by people who do understand large, complex organizations and do understand the time periods necessary to achieve some things properly. And I think that's up to their advisors. That's, in a sense, down to us. Last slide. I finished what I have to say, but you might be interested in what an 18th century poet had to say. I hope the slide is here, otherwise I'm going to be embarrassed. I'll leave Alexander Pope to speak for himself. Thank you very much.
Well, good morning to everyone. Peter, thank you for that kind introduction. I'm pleased to see that you didn't say I'd had a long and distinguished career, because in my job, when people start talking about you having had a long and distinguished career, you wonder if they're not trying to get rid of you. Perhaps I'm just inordinately suspicious. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today, and in the spirit of reconciliation, offer my respect to their elders, past and present. I'd also like to thank Professor Pollitt for an interesting speech, and it was an interesting speech, and a timely one, I think, for someone who has some interest in the APS. I'd like to thank IPAA for inviting me here today, and congratulate them on organising an interesting and indeed timely conference. I wish I could stay for more of it than I am, but unfortunately that's not possible. I'd also like to thank the sponsors for generously sponsoring the conference. I'd like to talk a little bit about Professor Pollitt's concepts, looking at it in the light of two challenges facing the Australian public service, and challenges that the APS will continue to face in the future. The first is the fiscal environment, and the second is the increasing contestability of the functions the APS performs. Let's talk about the fiscal environment first. After all, you can't have a discussion in Canberra amongst public servants these days without talking about the fiscal environment, and so it's a good way to start. We know we have a challenge of a very tight fiscal environment in the APS, and it's probably getting tighter. In my view, the fiscal environment will be tight for at least a decade. Now that's a challenge, but it's not the first time the APS has faced such a challenge, although those recruited since 2000 may not have appreciated that. We came through the last one fairly well, and I see no reason why we won't do that in this case as well. But we do need to embrace opportunities to be more effective and a smarter public service. And a more stringent fiscal situation is a powerful signal for us to do so. And incidentally, we have received that signal now from both sides of politics. Tough times are an opportunity for harder-headed thinking. Professor Pollitt rightly identified the importance of rigorous planning and deeper thinking in good public administration. I agree with his view that careful diagnosis of problems, realistic time budgets, careful monitoring and a willingness to adapt are all correlated with success, and their absence is associated with failure. A pity that it's not always the case in public service reform, as Professor Pollitt said, but we as public servants need to do our best to make sure it becomes the norm, not the exception. Professor Pollitt also said that public service reforms are not a straightforward process. It's quite challenging. I happen to wholeheartedly agree. As someone who's been on the inside of public service reforms, indeed as someone who has been a guinea pig in public service reforms, and public servants are the guinea pigs, fortunately or unfortunately, in public service reforms, they are quite challenging. And I found with considerable interest Professor Pollitt's comments on how often there had been rigorous analysis before or after the event in relation to public service reform. I also agree that we need customised solutions to fit particular needs, not branded reform products, and that the remedies are not the selection of a particular model, concept or technique, but rather lie in tailoring and combining the wide variety of knowledge and approaches available to us. There used to be a process in Australia that did exactly this. It was a serious white paper process. That fell into disuse, I think, in the starting in the late 90s. Interestingly, the current government has a number of white papers, quite deliberately, a large number of white papers in the planning process. Perhaps they will give us just that sort of approach that we need in a number of areas in Australia, including, perhaps in the future, public service reform. We do, however, have the Commonwealth Government's Commission of Audit as the initial step here in reform of government, and that should help facilitate thinking about future public administration, particularly at Commonwealth level, but of course it will also touch on the Commonwealth state dimension, as we know. But we as bureaucrats can't and should not simply wait for the Commission to do our thinking for us. We should already be adjusting priorities to meet the tightening fiscal environment, it's going to stay tight, and a new government, and thinking about the major changes that might come. I'm sure you are. If you're not, I suggest you do. We should not only be assessing the way we work, but also what we're working on. We should be reviewing our critical functions and looking at what we can and should stop doing. When discussing revolution, Professor Pollitt talks about the belief that large gains are to be had if only government could be better coordinated, both historically and vertically. And I say if only with a sigh, because as someone who's been working on better government coordination for a long part of his public sector career, we all know it's not easy. At the broadest level, this belief is tagged joined up government, a tag we're very familiar with. We've heard it a lot. Perhaps we've heard it a little too much, who knows. That said, I do believe that joined up government yields benefits, and big ones, for the taxpayer, for governments, for public servants, and for the service users, be they customers or citizens. And it provides much better outcomes for all of us. What, however, is sometimes forgotten is that joined up government works a lot better with a joined up public service. In fact, I'd argue it doesn't work without a joined up public service. And after all, if public servants are on the same team, they're much more likely to come together as one to work more effectively and more efficiently. I often speak of my belief of one APS. This is one aspect of one APS. One APS facilitates, indeed I believe is essential, for joined up Commonwealth government. But does one APS equate a monolith? No. Working at one APS does mean we must be mindful of our common purpose, but it does not mean we always agree on everything, or that we hold the same views, or that we do everything together. It does mean that we collaborate generously and constantly and work as a team. Why is the idea important, and why should we operate that way? After all, we haven't always operated that way in Canberra. The answer is because working as one APS does help us become more efficient, more responsive and more effective as a public servant. And that, in my view, is exactly what governments want and should expect of us. Indeed, operating as one APS is a sensible way of organising ourselves to respond to the expectations of government and of citizens alike. That we will deal with issues as a whole and in a joined-up fashion. Operating as one APS will be even more important if we are to successfully respond to the tighter fiscal environment and to the increasing volume and complexity of change that we face. Do I believe the Australian Public Service is working as one APS? Not yet. We have gotten a lot better over the last few decades, but there's room for improvement, and we will make sure we do continue to improve. But further, being on a panel today with one of my COAG colleagues, Chris Eccles from New South Wales, reminds me that we must also improve our ability not just to work as one APS, but also to strive to work together across all levels of government. After all, many of the challenges Australia faces are not only need to be addressed by the Commonwealth Government, but they need to be addressed by local and state governments as well. Let me talk to the increasing contestability of the functions that the APS performs. Avenues of advice to governments and policy implementation and delivery for government are likely to become more contestable over time. Some worry about the future of the APS in that contestability contest, but I don't think the APS has anything to fear from a genuinely contestable environment. And I do not think this environment will result in dissolution, or, as Professor Pollitt described it, the end of the public sector as a recognisably distinctive sector of society. On the contrary, I think increasing contestability provides incentives and opportunity for the public sector to adapt and to grow its strengths. The future public sector will be different. We all know that. We're quite different from the start of the APS 100 years ago, but will still be, in my view, recognisably distinctive. While the APS is no longer the sole source of advice or implementation or delivery to the Commonwealth Government, and indeed hasn't been for a very long period of time, we are, in my view, and I hate to sound like Sir Humphrey, which I occasionally do, irreplaceable. The APS sets itself apart from others by drawing on and emphasising our natural advantages, and we do have significant natural advantages. Our impartiality, our deep experience, and our dedication to national rather than any sectoral or personal interest. This increase in contestability is an opportunity for us not to hide these abilities, but to stand out, and not a portent of our dissolution. The idea that the private sector should take over public functions wherever possible, and that the private sector should model and that the public sector should model itself on the private sector has, in my view, some merit. But that merit is not unlimited. It is not open-ended. It is not the only end to which the APS needs to work. And it does not mean the dissolution of the APS. Our core characteristics of impartiality and objectivity will ensure we remain vital to governments. Finally, we do need to remember that no one is the repository of all knowledge. It therefore follows that no public servant would want to close their minister's ears or their own ears to the ideas of others. Rather than fearing competition, we should be sharpening our skills and playing on our strengths, ensuring that we evolve to the changing circumstances. The APS will, of course, have a role in testing alternative views, in ensuring ministers are better able to judge the value of competing pieces of advice, and that is a very important role. We should also be proactive about consulting, collaborating and cooperating with supposed competitors in order to ensure the best policy and program outcomes for government. Those outcomes come not from a lack of understanding of what's going on outside the APS, but from a better understanding of it. Now, increasing contestability is a challenge we will continue to face now and into the future, but I think the idea of dissolution underestimates the value that we provide as an impartial public service. And that's why, in conclusion, I'm an advocate of a public service that actively evolves to meet the changing environment in which it operates. I think Professor Pollitt is correct when he argues that governments do not govern alone, but usually in cooperation with a number of other players. A good Commonwealth public service needs to work in conjunction with those players to deliver outcomes for Australia. Australian public service has come a long way in the last 100-odd years. It will go a long way in the next 100-odd years. The evolution is a continuing, collaborative and context-dependent adaptation to a changing environment. It's also a rather complex thing to say, but it is important that we do continue to progress that evolution, because that, ladies and gentlemen, as we all know, is our future, and that's important to Australia. Thank you very much.
I'd like to thank IPAA for the opportunity to speak today. It's a rare privilege for me to be able to come and speak in the company of colleagues from around the country. I'm going to offer today, in addition to an Australian perspective, a provincial or subnational perspective in light of my experience in the jurisdictions that Peter mentioned. The perspective in due course is going to focus on a particular area of vexed service delivery. But first, I can't let the occasion of the 100th anniversary of the founding of Australia's capital pass unremarked. Some 25 years ago, as a young lawyer in the Commonwealth Public Service, I worked on the package of legislation to support the introduction of self-government for the Territory. And I had specific responsibility for the electoral system. So for the uninitiated or the forgetful, the initial electoral system, which is now changed, was derived from a proportional representation system known as modified DON, which delivered the purest correlation between voter intent and electoral outcome. Indeed, it was a system which delivered through that purity guaranteed instability in the popular chamber and therefore in government, and most notably in Italy, where for many years there were more governments than years since World War II. But not content with institutionalising minority government, I thought it was inherently undemocratic for political parties to be required to evidence a minimum membership. So in that first election we had an enormous ballot paper and political parties with tenuous pedigree. So we had the surprise party and we had the party, and my favourite, the sun-ripened warm tomato party. But even more interestingly, we had the Abolish Self-Government Coalition and the No Self-Government Party, the latter distinguished by the fact that its two elected members, backed in by the opponents of self-government, actually formed part of the First Ministry. So with a hand as clearly deft as mine on the early tiller of self-government, it's actually a tribute to the subsequent generation of public servants that order emerged from chaos and self-government has developed as a credible and important chapter in the last 100 years. Now back to the subject at hand. We've heard today about the shortcomings of the concept of dissolution, and I share that conclusion and I share the perspectives that inform it. But to these I'd add another. Fundamentally, I think the concept is flawed because of the leadership model that it relies upon. And here I'm talking about the form of that leadership rather than the direction of that leadership. Now, as I've said elsewhere, my view is that notwithstanding the more nuanced and subtle form of decision-making required by public sector leaders, the contemporary attributes of good leadership, such as genuine vision, regard for ethical and social responsibilities, self-awareness and reflection, and an ability to balance leadership dilemmas that arise from complex and uncertain situations, are commonly held across the public and other sectors, including the private sector. But the direction of that leadership is another thing entirely. The adoption of the dissolution model and the ending of the public sector as a recognisably distinctive sector of society would by definition mark the end of the need for public sector leadership. And with that demise would pass the responsibility for the exercise of contemporary public sector leadership in the three areas where it has a great and unique impact: good public governance, public trust, and whole-of-state public policy challenges. And it's in these areas that I believe stand in greatest contrast with the direction of private sector leadership. I'll briefly touch on that. The OECD describes governance as the way in which the underlying values of a nation are institutionalised, the formal aspects of this including the separation of powers, checks and balances, the means of transferring power, transparency and accountability. The leadership of the public sector should seek to both promote institutional adaptations in governance for the public interest and protect the fundamental values of that governance. At the Commonwealth level, you have recently navigated one critical part of good public governance, being the application of the Caretaker Conventions. Public sector leadership also needs to be focused on creating a sense of public trust for government stewardship role, and that trust is all the more important because of the emergence of a new civic culture. The 7th Global Forum of Reinventing Government described this in the following terms: the new civic culture demands sincerity and truthfulness in the words and deeds of representatives. It wants to be able to monitor government performance much more closely than before, rendering politics more transparent and dispersing the power of political decision-making to foster accountability. These are strong words. Citizens are demanding open, transparent government, a system with fair political processes, transparent decision-making, and a government acceptable to the people and accountable to the people. A government they trust. The public trust needs to actually also be a network of trust. It's intertwined. So citizens must be able to trust public institutions and must be confident those institutions will defend their interests. Public servants must be trusted by government and citizens for their integrity, their impartiality, and their expertise. And fundamentally, public servants must be able to trust government to do what it says. Great public sector leadership, not an echo derived from the experience of markets, is needed if we are to achieve a strong network of trust between citizens, the government, and the public service. The third area where public sector leadership has the greatest impact is in addressing and supporting the great whole-of-sector public policy challenges, such as responding comprehensively to fiscal restraint, an ageing population, social disadvantage, and the productivity deficit. Contemporary examples of massively scaled reforms that respond to these challenges include the National Disability Insurance Scheme and the National Education Reform Agreement. The successful negotiation of these reforms between New South Wales and the Commonwealth required public sector leadership from both levels of government, the kind of leadership that delivers real outcomes for citizens, the kind of leadership that can change people's lives, the kind of leadership that the dissolution model applied uncritically would consign to history. Now, in relation to revolution, I'm faced with a dilemma. From my Premier's perspective, a government that delivers a joined-up, agile, citizen-centric network of services is distinctly unrevolutionary, despite it being ambitious. I, as a public policy practitioner, on the other hand, know precisely how revolutionary the wholesale achievement of this ambition really is. So what do I do with my dilemma? Well, convincing the Premier of the revolutionary nature of this idea and easing his impatience with its absence is not an option, nor is the application of what Christopher tagged as big models and generalised concepts, or the latest magic bullet individual technique. There's no tolerance in the government for a sophisticated restatement of a service delivery challenge without generating real change. Our approach in New South Wales was, in one sense, to go for broke, to take arguably the single most complex and entrenched social policy challenge, child sexual assault in Aboriginal communities, and to tackle it in a radically different way. Now, I just want to now spend a little bit of time exploring that initiative and the way it connects with the concepts of revolution and evolution. So when the government was presented with the Ombudsman's report on child sexual assault in Aboriginal communities earlier this year, we could have responded, as we have in the past, by publicly releasing a response addressing each of the Ombudsman's 93 recommendations and making some adjustments to the status quo. However, we knew from past experience that this approach doesn't result in long-term, long-lasting significant change, as it focuses people's minds on responding to the crisis rather than the underlying structural factors that caused the crisis to occur in the first place. So, as Christopher noted in his speech, one of the crucial steps in developing reform is to go deeper, beyond the problems on the surface, in order to understand the complexities that lie beneath. So we realised from the outset that we needed to bring in different types of knowledge to go deeper. So to do this, we formed two groups with very different backgrounds and areas of expertise to work intensively over 2 months and advise the government on how to solve this seemingly intractable problem. One group was made up of senior executives from across the New South Wales Public Service who were selected to work intensively over that 2-month period. Similar to the APS 200 model used in the Commonwealth, we selected people based on their strategic thinking capacity and analytical skills rather than their expertise in a particular field, and I chaired this group. The other group was made up of Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people with expertise across a range of areas, including community work, economic development and business, governance and management, service delivery and clinical issues. Over the course of the 2 months, both groups developed their own ideas about the problems that needed to be tackled and the ways in which we could improve outcomes in Aboriginal communities. And although we worked separately, we periodically came together to test our assumptions and the solutions we were considering. Now, as public servants, it can sometimes be uncomfortable to share an untested idea outside the confines of government. It can be equally challenging for members of the public, particularly Aboriginal people, to trust that government will act in good faith when presented with information usually kept within the community. However, both groups were able to break through these constraints and had open and frank discussions about this particularly challenge and frankly sometimes distressing topic. In terms of diagnosing the problem, both groups agreed that child sexual assault doesn't occur in isolation. Rather, it's a manifestation of deeper economic and social disadvantage in communities coupled with intergenerational trauma. Now, the conventional government response to such a diagnosis has also failed. In some places, community members have seen their communities being overserviced, with large numbers of NGOs and state and Commonwealth agencies being funded to deliver overlapping or duplicating programs, but failing to achieve any real improvements in people's lives. In other places, multiple pilots and trials are commenced and then withdrawn, often with little or no input from the community and without any long-term solutions being developed. The overwhelming message is that government needs to stop doing things to or for communities. But in addition to the challenges faced by the communities, there are also a range of problems from our perspective, from government's perspective. Despite increased investment, we've seen no real progress in addressing child sexual assault in Aboriginal communities on a broad scale. And there are a number of reasons for this, including weak accountability mechanisms, a lack of shared responsibility across agencies, sectors and the community. Services are generally fragmented and poorly integrated, resulting in duplication in some areas and service gaps in others. The problem is compounded by a lack of information sharing across agencies and sectors, which means that children and families at risk can fall through the cracks and don't receive the support they need. So the story of the New South Wales initiative to date validates the preconditions for successful reform set out by Christopher, establishing the need for reform grounded in research and underpinned with evidence of the actual costs of maintaining the status quo, early comprehensive use of expert knowledge from both local and external perspectives, and frameworks that support the holding of true conversations. The unfinished story of this reform is underpinned by much of what Christopher has shared with us and goes to the third big idea of evolution, and specifically the need for governance, not government-framed analysis, and arrival at a contextually adapted mixture of services and regulation. In terms of proposing reform to these complex issues, both groups agreed we needed to overhaul the power dynamic that currently exists between government and Aboriginal communities. This means empowering communities to be a genuine leader and partner in determining outcomes and the way in which these will be achieved at the local level. Now, I know that partnership can often be a shallow descriptor which doesn't actually result in change in the balance of power, but partnership properly applied means exactly that: sharing responsibility and accountability for decision making and creating governance structures where government does not hold all of the power. Under the New South Wales proposal, shared outcomes will be agreed between community leaders and the government, with negotiations to be led by an independent broker. These outcomes will be underpinned by a community agreement that will set out how they are to be achieved and who is responsible for what. This will require a sustained commitment to leadership capacity building in Aboriginal communities, with leadership structures determined by the community, not imposed by government. A proposal currently before government is to implement reforms in communities on an opt-in basis, supported by a community readiness assessment to determine the type of support a community will require to participate in the reforms. It's often tempting to focus on what communities need to do in order to address a problem like child sexual assault and place less emphasis on the way in which government itself may be contributing to the problem. However, both groups recognise that while changes are required at the community level, government service design and delivery must change. Specifically, government must partner with local communities to determine the appropriate approach and model for the delivery of government services under the agreement, and there are various options. A new government agency on a regional or local level could be established with pooled funding to support service delivery in that particular community or region, or you take the option one step further, with that being managed by an NGO, which provides an additional element of public scrutiny and accountability for delivering the community agreement. Alternatively, a new NGO or private sector-led umbrella organisation could be established, overseen by a board which includes strong community representation. Now, the reforms we're developing recognise there's no one perfect solution, no one service model that will be right for every community, and responsibility must be shared across government, the community, the NGO and private sectors. We're a long way from being able to call these reforms a success story. In fact, we're barely at the beginning. And even if we are successful, we must remember Christopher's caution about the importance of contextual variation, that what works here doesn't work there, and what worked then will not necessarily work now. This means our public service should give up searching for the one truth, the perfect solution, and the single template. Instead, we need to look critically at the role of government and question how this role is best carried out in local community contexts. It means developing new governance and accountability structures that empower communities and our non-government and private sector partners to take a leading role in effecting change, while ensuring the unique and complex responsibilities of government are carried out in a way that is appropriate in the local context. In other words, we need to be prepared for reinvention and messiness. Indeed, in the midst of all the messiness associated with the evolutionary approaches to revolutionary service delivery reform, there is only one certainty, and that's dissolution won't get us there. Thank you.
I feel pleased and honoured to be part of such a distinguished panel this morning, and I particularly enjoyed Chris's discussion of the big ideas, and I'm also going to just reference a couple of those ideas in the experience of the Department of Employment. I did think when both Chris and Ian mentioned dissolution as part of their theme, and since I'm going to as well, that we might all be suffering some kind of existential angst about the dissolution of the public service, but obviously all three of us have come to the conclusion that there is plenty more to be done after and during dissolution. I wanted to talk about how we in the Department of Employment have over many years been playing out a part of the dissolution journey, and that's in the outsourcing of our employment services. Many of you may remember that in 1998 the Commonwealth Employment Service was privatised. Previously we had Commonwealth public servants assisting unemployed people to find work, but after the privatisation of that work we continued to pay unemployment benefit to unemployed people, but we instead hired the private sector to do work in helping those people to find jobs, using contracts and payment incentives to steer the market towards the outcomes we wanted. The intention and the outcomes that we sought were to deliver better assistance to unemployed people, to make sure that that assistance was targeted on the basis of their need and capacity, and to achieve better value for money. And the idea of better value for money is often what lies at the heart of the idea that Chris spoke of, that the private sector will be able to do things more efficiently than the public sector. Although the model's changed a bit over the years since then, that basic idea remains. It's now the program called Job Services Australia, and one of the things that we've clearly established through that process is that the competitive contracting out model does indeed provide value for money. In the mid-1990s, before privatisation, the average cost of each job outcome was somewhere between $10,000 and $16,000 in today's value. And under the current model, the average cost fell markedly to between $4,000 and $6,000 per job outcome at the outset, and it's now about $2,000 in 2012-13. But as Chris remarked, efficiency is only one value that the government seeks. And as Chris Eccles indicated, of course, the public sector has different demands and expectations of its leadership that go beyond efficiency and value for money, and that go to lasting value for the Australian community. Government considers equity and quality as being outcomes that are really important for us to achieve, not only to improve bottom line outcomes. And that means we don't just leave it to the market to decide who gets what. Otherwise, in the job services context, we'd be likely to see the most easy to place job seekers getting plenty of attention, and those of most disadvantage being left out and left in the ranks of the long-term unemployed. And so in the employment services sector, we have a range of mechanisms such as minimum quality standards. We have a star rating system by which we measure the performance of job service providers and reallocate more work to those who meet our standards. And we also pay more. We have incentives for employment providers who help job seekers get work who are more disadvantaged. And so all of those are endeavouring to use market-based mechanisms to steer the market towards an outcome rather than the government delivering the service in that way itself. But of course, another key difference for government from the private sector is that we are spending public money, and taxpayers expect us to be frugal for its expenditure and accountable. Shareholders in a company are probably less troubled about risks that a company takes along the way, even if some of those lose money, so long as at the end of the year the bottom line's showing a healthy profit. As any of us who've appeared before Senate estimates committees know, the public in that form is much less forgiving of mistakes or waste along the way. Now, there's a few ways that you can eliminate or at least reduce all those risks of waste and failure, but what they mainly mean is that we impose more regulation, or that's certainly been the habit until recently, and hopefully not so much in the future. So we have over time in job services increasingly imposed additional regulation to try and cut down on the understandable but undesirable tendency of the private sector to seek to maximise its profits, not necessarily in the direction of the outcomes that government's trying to achieve. So, for example, when we started the current model, job seekers were placed in 4 categories depending on their level of disadvantage and the likely need for greater assistance to get into work. And so those who were most difficult to place in employment had the job providers would get a higher payment if they successfully placed the more disadvantaged in work. And then after a 12-month period, there's a reassessment process to make sure that people who are still unemployed have been categorised in the right stream and maybe need to be in a different level of support. Now, if we let the providers do that reassessment, you can see there'd be an incentive for them to place lots of people into higher streams, because then if they get them into work, they'll get a higher payment for the outcome. And so, not trusting the sector to do that, we kept all of that assessment in-house and did a lot of detailed assessment of job seekers ourselves. So it was kind of like re-insourcing a whole lot of Commonwealth employment work. What that meant was very long delays in categorising people, long backlogs in reassessments, and the system therefore meant delays in getting job seekers properly assessed and into the stream where they could receive assistance. So we had to face the challenge of trying to cut regulation and red tape, but not hand the responsibility over to a sector that was inherently conflicted in the incentives that it had about how it might manage that risk. So what we've done to meet that is to no longer control the assessment process ourselves, but to create an automated model that characterises people by their particular characteristics, and that we test and evaluate from time to make sure that it is lining up with disadvantage. It's not that that's necessarily a perfect outcome either, but it was one of those ways of finding an opportunity to not do a heap of regulation ourselves, but not nevertheless surrender to the risk. And I think this is an important conundrum that we face at the moment with a government with a clear commitment to a deregulation agenda, and therefore clear targets for the public service to cut red tape, is to acknowledge that the need to do that involves reassessing what risks we take and how we take them. Because we pay people for outcomes in job services, it's quite an interesting case study in how we balance regulation and risk when we've outsourced services to others. For example, because we pay people for job outcomes, we've had instances where job providers have employed people themselves by creating a job within their own organisation, and therefore can get a payment for that person being in work even if it doesn't last. We've had a job service provider staff member make a report to a newspaper indicating that providers were claiming credit for getting a person a job when they weren't actually the people who'd got them the job. They'd got the job by themselves, or they couldn't prove that they'd got the job. We did an audit of it and found that 40% of those payment types couldn't be substantiated. We couldn't demonstrate that the providers had actually found the job for the person themselves. So it wasn't just a rogue or aberrant situation. This time what we did is try to reduce the risk of that happening again, but not in a way that increased regulation. We changed the structure of the outcome fees so that they weren't making as many fine distinctions between what kind of job outcome a person received, and then to balance off the slightly increased risk of inappropriate outcome payments, we established a tip-off line so that frontline staff could more easily report instances of non-compliance in their own organisations rather than thinking that their only outlet was to go to the media. I should say that I think although we are finding smarter ways to tighten up the system than through imposing regulation, we do need to recognise that there'll often be a hard learning journey along the way. We, in that instance, started with doing a very traditional, detailed, paper-based audit of the system, which spent many, many months of both the department's time and providers' time going through all of the transactions to identify who did what to whom. Since then, we've established a new system which, rather than audit every individual transaction, uses academics. Chris will be pleased to know we still see their value. Academics and actuaries to help make better use of the data, the whole of system data we've got, so that we can identify indicators of potentially problematic areas or potentially inappropriate claims, rather than go and check every single claim. And that way we can target our risk activities towards providers who might be in a higher risk category. And I think there is a lot of potential in that greater capacity that we have to do data analytics going forward, to be able to do the kind of risk managed approach to the reduction of regulation that will be necessary in a deregulatory environment. I should say I don't think that will mean we can ever get rid of the challenge of balancing the tension between risk and regulation. I know Jane Holton's at Estimates today, and I'll be there tomorrow, so I guess I'll get some first-hand experience about what the new appetite for risk is. But certainly we know that there will always be some incentives for the private sector to deliver services in a way that maximises their benefit rather than maximises the outcomes government may have been trying to achieve. And so it will come down to, as we seek to reduce red tape, how we'll better manage that risk and how we'll better sensitise politicians and the public to what risks it is that we're taking. As Chris Pollitt asked, how far are politicians willing to adjust the blame game in order to allow innovative approaches to be taken? I'd like to think that we could, to use a Blairite term, move to a third way, where we aren't just asking whether we can be at the risk end of the spectrum or at the red tape end of the spectrum, or somewhere in between, at which every trade-off of red tape inevitably means more risk, but rather rearrange how we do our work such that we could achieve both a reduction of red tape and a reduction of risk. And I think as we move in this direction, we are seeing features of what Chris Pollitt called the evolution phase of public sector service delivery, where we develop solutions in collaboration with those who are going to both provide them and receive them, where we're much more clearly focused on what the main outcome is that we're trying to achieve, rather than all the steps everyone has to jump through, and to be clear about what it is that we're regulating and what it is that we are explicitly leaving to market forces to determine. So as we work towards the next model of job services, we have established an advisory panel of experts and practitioners in the field, and rather than regulate every step of the process ourselves, we are establishing a quality assurance framework so that providers will go through an accreditation process that's managed independently of government to indicate their own capacity, capability, strengths of governance and financial management, and that will enable the industry to be much more self-regulated and for us to target our assurance activities more at those who are either less demonstrably capable or more likely to have weak governance systems. It also means that we are working with the industry to establish, if these are our outcomes, how do you think we could achieve them, rather than people in Canberra working this up in isolation from the front line. We're often able to find that the job service providers themselves could give us some good ideas about how to achieve the outcome in a way that doesn't involve a whole lot of regulation and red tape. So, the government is working in trying to get flexibility in service delivery, outcomes for job seekers, and accountability for taxpayer funds. I guess if you ask me again at estimates in a year's time whether we've achieved that, I'll be better placed to tell you. I think that in that evolution space, what we can see is that if we work together with all of the players in the industry and are open to their ideas, we're more likely to be able to evolve outsourced services that don't take all the risks of dissolution, but that rather deliver in an evolutionary way the kind of responsive and accountable services that the government expects us to provide. Thank you.